We've never received a single dollar from her. My father said it like it was nothing, like it didn't even need explaining. He didn't look at me, just raised his glass and glanced around the room, waiting for people to catch on. For a second, no one reacted. Then someone let out a small laugh, and that was enough. The rest followed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded certain. I stood there, trying to process what I just heard, because part of me still expected him to correct it, to smile and say he didn't mean it. He didn't. He just kept going, like that version of the story had always been true. And that's when it really hit me. Not all at once, but clearly enough I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't confusion. He wasn't forgetting. He was choosing a version where I didn't exist. And the worst part was, it worked. No one questioned him. No one asked a single thing. They just accepted it and moved on. They didn't know it yet, but that moment was the beginning of everything falling apart. Because if he was willing to erase me in a room like that, then I was done protecting anything he built. And if you want to understand why I didn't say a word that night, you have to go back to everything I'd been quietly holding together. The 30-year-old leech is finally gone. That's what my father said, standing under chandelier light, smiling like it was a toast. People laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to make it feel normal. Like I was the punchline everyone already agreed on. I stood there holding a glass I hadn't touched, heels digging into my feet after a 14-hour shift, watching faces I'd known for years turn away like this was just another family moment. I kept thinking someone would step in, someone would say it wasn't right. But no one did. Not my mother, not my sister, standing right beside him, soaking in the attention like it belonged to her. And that's when I realized something shifted. It wasn't just a joke to them. It was a role I'd been playing for years, and they were comfortable with it. So I set the glass down and looked straight at him. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. Then tell her to pay the bills. The room didn't laugh that time. It went quiet in that slow, uncomfortable way people get when the script breaks. My father's smile tightened. He looked around, expecting me to fold like I always did. But I didn't. And that's when he said the one thing that changed everything. Something I knew I could never ignore again. He let out a short laugh and shook his head, like I'd said something cute. Then he raised his glass again and looked around the room. "What bills?" he said. "We've never received a single dollar from you." A few people chuckled, unsure at first, then louder when he didn't correct it. I watched their faces shift from awkward to comfortable, like they'd been given permission to believe him. My sister didn't say anything. She just stood there, smiling softly, letting it land. I felt it hit, but not the way it used to. Not sharp, not overwhelming. Just clear. Because I knew exactly what he'd just done. He didn't forget. He didn't misspeak. He erased it. Every transfer, every late-night fix, every quiet bailout, gone in one sentence. And the worst part was how easy it was for him, how natural it felt. I could have argued, I could have listed everything right there. But I didn't. I just stood there looking at him, realizing something I should have seen years ago. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was denial. And if he was willing to say that out loud, then I needed to decide what I was going to do next. I walked out before anyone could say another word, pushed through the ballroom doors and didn't stop until the air felt different. My hands were shaking by the time I reached my car, not from embarrassment, but from something else building under the surface. Because what he said in that room wasn't new. It just sounded louder this time. On the outside, we looked like a normal family. My father ran a respected business, my mother hosted events people talked about, and my sister was always in the spotlight. She knew how to smile, how to talk, how to make people feel like they were part of something polished. And me? I was the one who stayed late, the one who fixed things quietly, the one who understood how quickly everything could fall apart if someone wasn't paying attention. At first, it started small. A call from my father asking if I could cover something short term. A delay in contractor payments. A tax payment that needed to go out before Monday. He always said it was temporary, just a timing issue, nothing serious. So I helped. Not because I had to, because I thought that's what family did. But then, it happened again. And again. The numbers got bigger, the gaps lasted longer, and the conversations got shorter. He stopped explaining. I stopped asking. I just transferred the money. Late at night, after my own work was done, I'd sit at my kitchen table with spreadsheets open, moving money between accounts that weren't even mine to manage. Payroll, liability coverage, vendor payments, things no one ever mentioned in public. My mother would talk about legacy. My sister would post about family values, and I would make sure the bills were paid. No one asked where the money came from. No one followed up after things stabilized. They just moved on like the problem had fixed itself, like it always did. I remember the first time I realized how deep it had gone. I was reviewing a payment history and saw the pattern laid out in front of me. Month after month, gap after gap, each one quietly filled by me. Not once acknowledged. Not once recorded as anything more than a temporary adjustment. That's when I started saving everything. Every transfer confirmation, every invoice, every message asking for help that somehow turned into expectation. I didn't think of it as evidence at the time. It was more like a way to keep track of something no one else seemed to see, or maybe didn't want to see. Because the truth is, it was easier for them if it stayed invisible. Easier to believe the business was stable. Easier to let my sister shine. Easier to pretend my role didn't matter. And I let it happen. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually things would level out, and someone would recognize what was actually holding everything together. But that moment never came. Instead, I stood in a ballroom and listened to my father erase years of support with one sentence. And for the first time, I stopped trying to make it make sense. Because if he could deny it that easily, then maybe it was time I looked at exactly what I had been carrying all along. I got home, dropped my keys on the counter, and opened my laptop without even turning on the lights. The screen lit up the room just enough, and I sat there for a second, staring at a folder I hadn't opened in months. It was labeled Harbor. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would stand out if anyone else saw it. Just a quiet place where I had been putting things over time, without really admitting why. I clicked it open. Inside were subfolders, organized by month, then by type. Payroll coverage, liability coverage gaps, tax payments, vendor settlements, legal fees tied to my sister's situations. Every category had files, and every file had a timestamp. I started opening them one by one. Bank confirmations, screenshots, emails asking for help that somehow turned into instructions. Notes I had written to myself at 2 a.m, trying to keep track of what had been covered and what was coming next. And the thing that hit me wasn't how much there was. It was how normal it all looked. Clean, organized, quiet, like it had always been part of the system. I scrolled further, and for the first time, I didn't just see transactions. I saw a pattern, a structure that only worked because I kept filling in the missing pieces without anyone noticing or questioning it. That's when it shifted for me. Not emotionally, but logically. Because if everything they had was built on this, then everything they believed about themselves was wrong. And I realized something else. I didn't need to explain any of it. I just needed to let it exist. Because once it was seen, it wouldn't need me to defend it. I sat there at my kitchen table and started adding everything up. Not roughly, not in my head, but line by line, category by category, making sure every number matched what I had sent. It took longer than I expected. Not because it was complicated, but because there was more of it than I ever let myself see all at once. Transfers I barely remembered making, payments I told myself were one-time fixes that quietly became routine. When I finished, I leaned back and looked at the total sitting at the bottom of the screen. $162,400. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't off. I wasn't. And in that moment, it stopped feeling like help. It felt like something else entirely. Something structured. Something real. Something I could no longer pretend didn't matter. Because if that number existed, then everything after this had to change. I closed the laptop and just sat there for a minute, staring at nothing, letting that number settle into something real. Then I opened it again, not to review anything, but to make a decision I had been avoiding for years. I logged into the accounts I had access to, the same ones I had been quietly managing behind the scenes, and started removing myself from them one by one. Backup authorizations, scheduled transfers, emergency coverage settings I had set up without telling anyone. Each click felt small, but I knew what it meant. I wasn't taking anything. I wasn't touching money that wasn't mine. I wasn't doing anything illegal or dramatic. I was just stepping back from something I had been holding together for too long. And the more I went through it, the clearer it became. They didn't need me to stay. They needed me to keep fixing things. There's a difference. So I turned off the automatic transfer that covered the property tax reserve. I removed my backup from contractor payments bridging. I canceled the liability coverage payment I had been fronting every quarter. Quietly, cleanly, no announcement, no warning. Because if I said something, they would argue. They would minimize it, twist it, turn it into another conversation where I ended up explaining things that should have been obvious. I wasn't doing that anymore. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about stopping. And that was the part I finally understood. Stopping wasn't passive. It was the only move that actually changed anything. So I closed every tab, shut down the laptop, and for the first time in years, I went to bed without checking what they needed next. Because by morning, they were going to feel it. Sunday evening, I walked into my parents' dining room like nothing had changed. Same polished table, same candles, same quiet expectation that everything would stay controlled. My mother was already seated, adjusting her napkin like presentation mattered more than anything else. My sister sat across from her, calm, composed, like the past few days hadn't happened at all. My father didn't wait. "You embarrassed yourself the other night," he said, cutting straight through the room before anyone even picked up a fork. "You owe your sister an apology." I pulled my chair out slowly and sat down, letting that settle for a second. "I'm not apologizing," I said, "not for telling the truth." He leaned back, like he'd expected resistance but not confidence. "What truth?" he asked. "That you've built some version of reality where you're supporting this family?" There it was again. Same tone, same dismissal. Like if he said it enough, it would become fact. My mother stepped in quickly, soft voice, controlled smile. "Lauren, if you've helped here and there, it's because you wanted to. Families help each other." I turned toward her. "Did I want to cover the warehouse liability coverage when it lapsed?" She didn't answer. I looked at my sister next. "Did I want to pay your attorney retainer when that contract issue came up?" Her expression shifted just slightly, enough to see it. My father tapped the table, harder this time. "Enough," he said. "You're not going to sit here and accuse us of using you." I held his gaze. "I'm not accusing you," I said. "I'm describing what happened." And that was the moment I felt it again. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity. Because they weren't confused. They were choosing this. Choosing to rewrite it in a way that made them comfortable. So I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Not the full breakdown. Not everything I had. Just enough. I slid it across the table toward him. "Take a look," I said. He picked it up with that same dismissive expression, already ready to push it back. But halfway down the page, his hand stopped. My mother leaned over to read it, and I watched her face change in real time. My sister tried to see from across the table but didn't say anything. No one spoke. Not immediately. And for the first time since I walked in, the room didn't feel controlled anymore. It felt uncertain, because they had just seen something they couldn't talk around, and I hadn't even shown them everything yet. He kept reading, slower this time, like the numbers weren't lining up with what he wanted to believe. His eyes moved from line to line, then back again, checking dates, amounts, trying to find something he could dismiss. "There's more," I said, not raising my voice, just enough to hold the room where it was. My mother straightened in her chair, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to concern. My sister finally leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the page, but my father didn't pass it over. "These are just adjustments," he said, but it didn't sound certain anymore. "Temporary things." I shook my head once. "No," I said, "they're records." That word landed differently, because records don't argue, they don't exaggerate, they just sit there, waiting to be read. My mother reached for the paper, and this time he let her take it. She scanned the first few entries, then looked up at me like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. "How much is this?" she asked. I didn't answer right away, because that question was the one that mattered. And it was the one I hadn't said out loud yet. I leaned back slightly, watching all three of them, letting that silence stretch just enough to settle in. "Do you really want the full number?" I asked, because once I said it, there was no going back. Monday morning, I was already at work when my phone started buzzing. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. I let it ring once, then twice, then picked up on the third. "Payroll didn't clear," my father said. No greeting, no pause. "What did you do?" I stepped outside, watching containers move across the dock like nothing had changed. "I didn't do anything," I said. "I stopped doing what you said I never did." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then his tone shifted, faster, sharper, trying to regain control. "This isn't funny," he said. "People are waiting on checks." I leaned against the railing, steady. "Then you should handle it," I said. "It's your business." He started talking over me, listing problems like I hadn't heard them before. Cash flow, vendor pressure, timing issues. The same cycle, just louder now. But something was different. He wasn't asking. He was reacting. Because for the first time, the system wasn't smoothing itself out behind the scenes. There was no quiet fix waiting to catch it before anyone noticed. And it showed. By midday, my mother had called twice. My sister texted asking if I could just help this one time. The tone was softer, but the expectation was still there, like nothing fundamental had changed. Except it had. They were feeling the gap now. Not emotionally. Not yet. But structurally. And that was the part they couldn't ignore, because once something breaks at that level, it doesn't stay contained for long. I met Daniel that afternoon at a small cafe near the port, the kind of place where no one listens too closely. I brought my laptop, opened the harbor folder, and turned it toward him without saying much. He didn't react right away. He just started reading, scrolling, clicking, going back to check dates. Then he leaned back slightly, eyes still on the screen. "This isn't just support," he said. "This is structure." That word stayed with me, because once he said it, everything shifted again. We started lining things up side by side, my transfers on one column, public statements on the other, my father talking about stability, about being self-funded, about holding everything together, my sister posting about independence, about building her own image, her own career. And right there underneath it all were my numbers. Consistent. Timed. Filling every gap they pretended didn't exist. That's not oversight, Daniel said quietly. That's intentional. I didn't answer, because I was already seeing it, not just the money, but how it had been used. Some of my transfers were labeled differently in the internal records. Not all of them, just enough to blur the picture. Enough to make it look like things were under control when they weren't. And then there were the expenses tied to my sister. Clothing, branding, events, things that kept her image intact while I was covering the cost behind it. All routed through the same accounts my father claimed were struggling. That was the moment it stopped being about respect and started being about control. Because it wasn't just that they took the help, they built a version of reality around it. One where I didn't exist. One where they could stand in public and believe their own story. And once I saw that clearly, I knew this wasn't something that could stay private anymore. I got home that night and found the invitation still sitting on my counter, the one my mother had dropped off weeks earlier like it was something I was expected to attend without question. The Whitmore Foundation dinner? Yacht club? Half the people my father needed to impress would be there. I picked it up and read it again, slower this time. Names I recognized. Sponsors. Board members. People who believed the version of our family that had been carefully maintained for years. The same people who had laughed at that gala without thinking twice. My phone buzzed while I was standing there. A message from my sister. Big night tomorrow. Don't make things worse. I stared at that for a second. Not, come talk. Not, let's fix this. Just, don't disrupt the image. That told me everything I needed to know. Because if they were still thinking about appearances, after everything that had already started breaking, then they still believed they could manage it, control it, keep it contained. I set the invitation back down and looked at my laptop. The folder was still open. Every file, every record, every piece of something they thought didn't exist. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about whether I should bring it up. I was thinking about where it needed to be seen. Because if he was willing to stand in another room and repeat the same story, then maybe that's exactly where it needed to end. I arrived 10 minutes late on purpose, just enough for the room to settle into its rhythm. Glasses clinking, low conversations, my father already moving between tables like nothing had shifted. My mother saw me first. Her smile held for a second, then tightened. My sister noticed next, her posture changing just slightly, like she wasn't sure how close I would get. I didn't rush. I walked in, found a clear spot near one of the side tables, and set my bag down carefully. The binder stayed inside for a moment while I took everything in. The room looked exactly the way it always did. Controlled, polished, certain. Then my father stood to speak. He thanked everyone for their support, talked about integrity, about how much the business had grown through discipline and hard work. Same tone, same confidence, like the last few days hadn't even touched him. That was my cue. I stepped forward before he could sit back down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The shift in movement was enough to draw attention. Before we move on, I said, there's something that needs to be corrected. You could feel the room pause. My sister said my name quietly, warning, but I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on him. At the last event, I said, you told everyone here that you've never received a single dollar from me. A few people exchanged looks. My mother stood halfway, like she might interrupt, then stopped. I reached into my bag and pulled the binder out, setting it flat on the table beside me. The sound carried more than I expected. That wasn't accurate, I said. My father stepped toward me, lower voice now, controlled. This isn't the place, he said. You made it the place, I replied. I opened the binder and turned to the first tab. I didn't flip through everything. I didn't need to. I read just enough. Payroll coverage, 17,400. Warehouse liability coverage, 8,300. Property tax installment, 12,200. Legal retainer tied to Caroline's contract, 6,000. I didn't rush the numbers. I let them land. The room wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't even whispering. It was listening. My father reached for the binder, but I held it steady. "If you want to review it," I said, "you can. It's all there. Dates, accounts, confirmations." One of the men from the front table stepped closer. Someone my father had been trying to impress all night. He glanced at me, then at the binder, and I nodded once. He took it. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because it wasn't just me speaking anymore. It was someone else reading. Page after page, his expression changed. Not dramatic, just subtle enough to register. Another man leaned in beside him. My mother sat back down slowly. My sister stopped moving altogether. "These are confirmed?" the man asked. "Yes," I said. "Every transfer is documented." My father tried to step in again, voice tighter now. "This is being taken out of context," he said. "These were temporary adjustments." "No," I said, calm, steady. "They were support." That word carried, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. Support wasn't accidental, it wasn't invisible, and it definitely wasn't nothing. My sister finally spoke, her voice sharper than I expected. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said. "This isn't necessary." I looked at her for the first time. "What's unnecessary," I said, "is pretending it never happened." Silence again. The man holding the binder closed it halfway and looked directly at my father. No anger, no accusation. Just a different kind of attention, the kind you can't talk your way out of. My father's expression changed then, not all at once, but enough. The certainty was gone. The control wasn't holding the same way. He looked at me, then at the people around him, then back at me again. "Please," he said, quieter now. "We can discuss this later." That word hit differently, not because it was loud, because it wasn't. I stepped back slightly, giving the space back to the room. "This is the discussion," I said, and I let the binder stay where it was, because at that point, I didn't need to say anything else. They had already seen enough. He didn't argue after that. That's what stood out first. Not the silence in the room, not the way people were looking at him differently, but the fact that he had nothing ready. No explanation, no confident correction, no way to pull it back under control. He just stood there, blinking like the numbers might change if he waited long enough. Then he looked at me again. "Please," he said, softer this time. "Don't do this here. Not, 'You're wrong.' Not, 'This isn't true.' Just, don't do this." And that's when it landed. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to stop it. I watched his shoulders drop just slightly, the way they do when someone realizes the room has already moved on without them. The people he had been performing for weren't reacting the same way anymore. They weren't laughing. They were thinking. And he felt it. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. Because everything he built that moment on, control, image, certainty, was already gone. And all that was left was him standing there, asking me to hold it together for him again. But that wasn't happening. Because this time, I wasn't the one holding anything anymore. I stepped back from the table and adjusted my bag, giving the room just enough space to process what they'd already seen. No one stopped me. No one tried to pull it back into a conversation. So I said it clearly. "Effective immediately, I'm no longer covering anything," I said. "Not contractor payments, not liability coverage, not taxes, not personal expenses. All of it goes back to where it belongs." My father shook his head, like he could still push this into something smaller. You don't need to make a declaration, he said. We'll figure it out. I held his gaze. You should have already, I said. My sister opened her mouth like she was about to argue, then stopped. My mother didn't say anything at all. She just looked down at the table, avoiding the binder completely. That told me everything, because this wasn't about convincing them anymore. It was about ending it. So I picked up my bag and turned toward the exit. And as I walked out of that room, I knew they hadn't felt the full impact yet, but they were about to. By the end of that week, the calls stopped sounding controlled. They sounded urgent. I was at work when my father called again, earlier than usual this time, voice tighter, words coming faster. We've got vendors asking questions, he said. Payments are delayed. This is getting out of hand. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. Because for years, I had heard the same problems framed like they were temporary. Timing issues, small gaps, nothing serious. But now, without anything smoothing it out behind the scenes, those small issues were stacking up in real time. And it showed. Payroll didn't stabilize. One delay turned into another. Then suppliers started changing terms, asking for upfront payment instead of trust. The kind of shift that doesn't happen unless something deeper feels off. My mother called next, trying a different angle. Softer tone, measured words. We just need a little time, she said. Things are tense right now. I leaned back in my chair, hearing it clearly for the first time. Not a request, an expectation. Still, like I would step back in if things got uncomfortable enough. I didn't. Then my sister reached out. Not publicly, not through messages people could see. A direct call, voice lower than usual. This is affecting everything, she said. My contracts, my schedule, people are starting to ask questions. I let her finish. Because that was the first time she acknowledged it, not what I did, but what it held together. And now that it wasn't there, things were shifting. Faster than they expected. Within 2 weeks, the cracks turned into something visible. A refinancing deal my father had been working on quietly fell apart. Without consistent numbers to support it, the story he had been telling didn't hold. The house my mother cared so much about went into quiet listing. No announcement, no explanation, just a shift no one talked about. And my sister? Her appearances slowed down, then stopped. Not because she wasn't capable, but because the stability behind her image wasn't there anymore. Everything they had relied on started showing its weight. And the part that stayed with me wasn't the collapse itself. It was how fast it happened once I stepped back. Because it meant one thing was true the entire time. None of it had ever been as stable as they claimed. It just looked that way. Because I was there. I walked out of my office one evening and saw him waiting near the entrance, leaning against his car like he had been there for a while. His suit wasn't as sharp as usual, tie slightly loose, posture heavier than I'd ever seen it. For a second, I paused. Not because I was surprised, but because I had never seen him look like that before. You made your point, he said as I got closer. You can stop now. No apology, no acknowledgement, just stop. I set my bag down on the hood of my car and looked at him. That's not how this works, I said. He shook his head, like I was being unreasonable. Things have gotten out of hand, he said. People are talking. Deals are falling through. This doesn't need to go any further. I watched him carefully. Because even now, he still wasn't asking what he had done wrong. He was asking me to fix it again. You didn't lose control because of me, I said. You lost control because it was never yours. That landed harder than anything I'd said before. He went quiet for a second, then looked away. And in that moment, I realized he still didn't understand what had actually ended. A few weeks later, I signed the lease on a place by the water, smaller than my parents' house, but quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. No late-night calls, no spreadsheets open at midnight, no running mental checklist of what needed fixing next. I set my keys down that first night and just stood there for a second, listening. Nothing. And that was the point. I still worked the same job, same hours, same responsibilities, but it felt different without something constantly pulling at me in the background. I started noticing things I hadn't had time for before: how quiet mornings could be, how steady things felt when they actually belonged to you. Daniel and I ended up turning some of that work into something real. Small at first, just helping a few companies clean up their numbers, make sense of what wasn't being tracked properly. The kind of work I had been doing for free, just applied somewhere it was actually recognized and paid. I didn't talk about my family, not at work, not in passing, not even when people asked general questions. It wasn't something I needed to explain anymore, because the distance wasn't about anger. It was about clarity, about knowing exactly where my time, my effort, and my value were going. And for the first time in a long time, they were going to me. I kept one page from that binder in my desk, not to revisit the past, but to remind myself how easily value can disappear when it stays unspoken. It's strange how long you can carry something quietly before realizing it's the only thing holding everything up. For a long time, I thought strength meant staying, fixing, absorbing whatever came next. I thought if I just did enough, eventually it would be seen. It wasn't. What changed wasn't them. It was me deciding to stop proving something that should have been obvious, because the truth doesn't need volume. It needs clarity. And once it's clear, it doesn't argue. It doesn't chase. It doesn't ask to be believed. It just exists. Looking back, I don't think of it as revenge. I think of it as accuracy. Everything lined up exactly as it was. And once that happened, the rest didn't need me anymore. There's a difference between being needed and being valued, and it takes time to see it clearly. For years, I thought showing up, fixing things, and staying quiet was enough. I thought consistency would eventually turn into respect. It didn't, because people don't always recognize what carries them. They just get used to it. And when something becomes expected, it slowly disappears in their eyes. What I learned is simple. If your value only exists when you're giving, then it's not being respected. It's being used. And sometimes, the strongest decision you can make is to step back and let the truth stand on its own.